Mr. Hatfield lived down the cove from our church, and he would always come in the back door and walk to his pew. And when I say his pew, I really mean it was his pew. No one else ever sat there. Ever. You could hear the cloth of his faded overalls rubbing the pew, and the clunk of his cane as he shuffled to the left wall of the church. There was an uneven, greasy spot on the drywall where he would take off his hat and lean his head. As he sat down, you could hear the distinct thump of his gun against the pew. Inevitably, he would fall asleep as the service progressed and begin to snore in a surprisingly soft and rhythmic manner. When Dad finally was received into the community as a favored outsider, and make no mistake, unless you were born and raised there, no matter how long you stayed, you were always an outsider. Our family learned that we had been granted an audience at Mr. Hatfield's house. It was next to impossible to keep my anxiety and curiosity from eating the heart out of me until it was time to pay that visit. Mr. Hatfield, with his greasy spot and gun, had always been an enigma to this greenhorn and as yet unarmed, well, unless you count my cap gun, boy. So I cannot begin to describe the sights, frights, and delights of that visit, but I will certainly try. When we arrived, Mr. Hatfield, who had not given himself the comfort of a wash, knelt down close and looked me over with a smiling and impudent curiosity. It didn't appear he had ever laid eyes on me till that very minute, even though he had passed by me plenty of times at church. His smell nor his consideration fazed me. I told you I ain't never met a stranger, and this was to be no exception. Our tall but now stooped and wizened host helped settle in my somewhat uneasy mom and dad at the old wooden table, in a kitchen that smelled like rotting paper or dirty socks. The table had one of those red and white checkered tablecloths that always feel like greasy plastic. You could slide your thumb around in circles as easy as can be. My sis, who could not be pried from Mom's side with a crowbar, would not touch it. Mr. Hatfield offered us what he called grape juice. He told us that he had made it with his very own grapes from the yard. He called them muscadines. Having never heard that term before, I warily took a sip, and was sold from that very moment. It was mighty tasty. Everybody liked it, even my sis Cheryl, who could be a tad picky at times. It tasted sweet, sort of like that candy-flavored cough medicine Mom would give us. But the more you drank, the less medicine-y it became. It just got better and better. A little later, as we moseyed out to the front porch at Mr. Hatfield's invitation to sip a bit, I noticed my parents starting to relax, almost as if by magic, and Sis kept giggling. After sitting for a spell and visiting, Mr. Hatfield asked Mom if it would please her if the men folk excused ourselves to take a stroll and look around. By that time, my brother Terry and I had sat still long enough. I reckon we must have been ensconced on the edge of that decomposing wooden steps for what seemed like at least 10 years, and as far as I was concerned, that officially qualified us as menfolk. We proudly sauntered away with the fellows. Sure, the women folk couldn't help but watch and be a tad bit jealous of our masculine camaraderie. I grabbed a blade of grass, sucked on it, and savored the strange sense of euphoria that seemed to have anointed my every member. Come to think of it, all the members of our little soiree seemed to have been struck with a similar euphoric anointing, and we wasn't even at church. Being hungry for man talk, I turned all my curiosity to the circumstances of this opportunity and was elated and ready to make the most out of it that could be made. I sidled up beside the shambling Mr. Hatfield like I belonged, pulled myself up as tall as I could, and asked, "Now tell me honest and true, how long you lived here without electrification?" 'Cause there was nary a power line to be seen down in the wilds of that isolated domicile. As I scrutinized his face for an answer, his rheumy but steely gray eyes fixed on me, and he chewed thoughtfully on what I knew was certainly not a blade of grass. A moist dribble of brown oozed downward through his poorly shaved and graying stubble. It originated from the droopy right-hand corner of his mouth, continued along a misshapen jawline that I'm sure had once been square enough to chisel granite, and cascaded amidst his pendulous dewlaps, disappearing beneath his stained and faded undershirt. He, also being euphoric, began to talk in a happy, thoughtless, almost boyish fashion as we walked along. My dad and brother were quite content to trail behind and let me carry the conversation. We made friends at once. He told me all sorts of things about himself and would ask me an occasional question about myself, but never waited for an answer. As we strolled and talked, we came up to an old abandoned well. It was round and made of mountain rock and was about 3 feet tall. It had 2 round wooden columns supporting an angled roof covered in wood shakes, and still had a tattered rope wrapped around an old dowel. The opening of the well was covered with several crisscross layers of old boards and rusty metal. Standing there filled with euphoria, he recounted a story that still makes the cold chills creep over me. As it goes, he and his former wife got in a fight once, and he got over it and she didn't. As he laid accent upon the word she, he leered sideways at the well with those steely gray eyes, and as if on cue, I swear it, the scream of a raven echoed eerily through the cove. We all unconsciously edged away from the well, and like a man who realized he may have said too much, he came to his senses and said a little too hastily, "I was just joshing. Now, let's go make sure that wife of yours is still doing okay, Reverend." He pointed back toward the house with a massive but gently shaking hand, pockmarked with blue dots. I learned later those came from a coal mining explosion. Something in me seemed to believe his story. My consciousness, you could say, but my reason just couldn't. My reason straightway began to clamor, and I suppose that was natural. I didn't know how to go about satisfying it, because I knew the normal laws of men didn't apply in these parts. My consciousness screamed he was a murderer, but my budding reason said if the man was sane, he wouldn't be capable of killing his own wife. She probably just took a long trip somewhere, or something like that. At least that's what I told myself. It was the first time my consciousness and reason got into a serious tussle, and it wouldn't be the last. As we drove down that long, lonely road out of Hatfield Cove, perched on my knees in the seat, peering back over the window through the trees and dust and watching the sunset, it wasn't just the day slipping away. My soul felt a little lost somehow.